So the example that I showed of a part of the memoirs on folklore was pretty short indeed, but eventually we have the collection of tales, folk tales that are a little bit longer and that give us a little bit more insight into the kind of mental processes that are involved in the folklore society and the stories that are gathered over those years. And this is an example from the Pawnee of Skiddy, from another memoir, another volume of the memoirs of the Folklore Society, dated from 1904. There was a big village, and on the west side of the village lived Coyote with his family. Although Coyote was a man, people could see hair upon his breast, so that they knew that he was Coyote and he was tricky. On the south side of the village lived an old woman and a little boy, her grandson. Coyote, roaming through the woods, would stop and stand and would go whooping to a tree to get their attention of some other animal in the timber. He was known all over the country. Coyote is a kind of a ubiquitous character in indigenous stories and variously attached to all kinds of characters, and we'll get to that a little bit more a little bit more in as we go over the semester. But the coyote, to be short, is a pretty common character in mythological systems of indigenous people in North America, as well as the raven and the bear and others around around the United States. But as a result of that, the coyote takes all kinds of shapes and indeed usually associated to what we would call a shapeshifter. In this particular context here, we have a pretty good example of coyote as a man, but also an animal that lives in the woods. Now, the story of people seeing an animal that is hairy living in the woods and kind of going around with hijinks around, your society, um, is not completely unknown to us. The stories of Sasquatch that we are going to talk about next week, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Abominable Snowman, all those different variations of about the same thing, a weird looking, perhaps human, but not really human thing that is mostly hairy and that doesn't really want to hurt us and just, is around. And in this case, he was known all over the country. So the parts of the mythology here become part of the folklore stories that are gathered by people like Newell in the Folklore Society. So this part here is from the first issue of the Journal of American Folklore. Um, connected to the Folklore Society, of course, especially again, as I mentioned on yesterday's lecture, that is something that is very much, or an organization that is very much being adopted by a lot of early anthropologists at the time. And if you read the text that is posted on Blackboard to this week, it has to do with this particular story of the folklore and anthropology and whether or not those two things were living together, friendly together, and how the kind of weird politics of it have worked out over the years. This is much more of a historical account that is part of the reading. Now I'm looking at the net effect of that is that you have anthropologists that are part of the folklore society. And of course, as a result of that, they will gather these stories as part of their ethnographic research. Newell, like I said on Monday or yesterday, was not an anthropologist himself, but he was very much interested in that same goal that we are looking at. In the first number of this journal, it was pointed out that it was the intention of the editors to include the mythology of the native races in the scope of their labors, an inclusion obviously wise and necessary. But in making this statement, it was by no means intended to discuss the relation of the terms folklore and mythology. As to whether these terms can be precisely distinguished or limited to separate provinces, opinions may differ. The appellation mythology will continue to be applied to that living system of tales and beliefs which, in primitive peoples, serves to explain existence. Folklore was primarily invented to describe the unwritten popular traditions of civilized countries. So the difference, as he points out here, is pretty clear. It is one of essentially 18th, 19th century racism, the difference between the people who were considered to be civilized, and in this context, quote unquote, civilized people, had a folklore of popular traditions, and the other people, the quote unquote primitive people, savages, barbarous, and all that, they have these systems of tales and beliefs which explain existence. So there you can see pretty easily how those connections will be made over the years, especially once we realize that there is no such thing as civilized people, savage peoples, and whatever, and that people are just people. The differentiation between mythology and folklore will be very narrow. But most especially in this context, we have an idea of myth having a clear definition, whereas folklore could get to contain all kinds of things. Um, and the fact that very quickly we have mythological stories that become part of folklore, and it especially has to do with the again this anthropological outlook on the folklore society gets to us to a much more important aspect of the meaning of this folklore is that you have the people like Newell, for example, who believe that the idea of studying folklore was to study um, the material itself, not necessarily the attitude behind it, because as I said yesterday, the most of that is about recording, not necessarily contextualizing it or understanding it. Yet Newell kind of tries to make sense out of the idea of folklore in a much broader sense. And that is very useful to everyone who is involved in this conversation, because certainly if we talk about folk and their lore, and this is where the word comes from, and this is also why the name is spelled in two words up until very recently, or at least in those early years of the Folklore Society, then we start to think of a lot of various genres, perhaps, that could be part of folklore. That it's not just a matter of tales, but it's also a matter of customs, a matter of practices, a matter of a bunch of things that people can do. So this is from the same issue of the journal, just a different article. It is apparent that what distinguished in common the numerous subjects included under the name folklore is their character of oral tradition. Lore must be understood as the complement of literature, as embracing all human knowledge handed down by word of mouth and preserved without the use of writing. Since this knowledge is originally common to a whole people and alike for all ranks of the nation, it is properly designed as folklore. Does not appear either desirable or possible in dealing with a primitive people to include a part or exclude another part of its traditions. In dealing, therefore, with the Indian tribes of America, it is the intention of this journal to include the entirety of their oral traditions. So folklore during that time is very much associated with these oral traditions, not the written traditions. And again, right, this is a pretty straightforward racist attitude of if people do not have a way to write their language, then they don't have a way to communicate these ideas, and they are considered to be inferior as a result of that. And that is not obviously the case. People, for a reason that we cannot fully understand, sometimes decided to write down their language, sometimes they did not. That's not meant to be a commentary on the value of their culture, at least not for us anymore. But that is how that discipline of mythology becomes practiced increasingly separately from the practice of the study of folklore. And anthropologists during that time have to walk that tightrope of providing an ethnographic outlook on people that they do not necessarily consider to be inferior. Although, again, in those early years, there were plenty of anthropologists who had plenty of biases. And on the other hand, also providing an account that is full and much more useful to the study rather than the example that I showed yesterday of a couple of lines that essentially could be a bit of gossip, if you will. And so Newell points out the term folklore as its most definite significance in connection with civilized people in modern Europe, having been invented by an anonymous correspondent of the Athenaeum, London in 1846, who signed his name Ambrose Martin, understood to be the pseudonym of W.J. Toms. So there is apparently a person that invented this word folklore. He included another title. manners, customs, observances, superstitions, ballads, proverbs, and claim the honor of introducing into the language the word folklore, as Disraeli had claimed the honor of fatherland. The latter word has not met with success, but folklore has been accepted in not only English speech, but also in most European languages. And in fact, yes, there were other folklore societies that started popping up here and there. There was one in England, of course, but then it ended up happening in France also, where the word folklore was just imported wholesale here. And of course, this conversation here becomes one of discipline and one of professional practice. And again, the Darnell article that is posted on Perusal slash Backboard goes into exactly how much this is a professional argument, much more than anything else. And again, the politics of it are pretty unsavory when you think of the fact that this is supposed to be a bunch of scientists, supposedly smart people who are making all of these efforts to define themselves by contrast with somebody else rather than studying a subject that they are interested in. There was some protest against these, in as much as the name folk belongs properly to races in which isolated tribes have been amalgamated into something resembling a nation. But this difficulty could not be allowed to to prevent a convenient inclusion. So the expression came to be used first in a definite sense as including tales, beliefs, and practices now retained among the unlettered peasantry of Europe. Secondly, with a wider connotation as embracing traditionary tales, customs, and usages of uncivilized races. In its broader meaning, therefore, folklore is a part of anthropology and ethnography, embracing the mental side of primitive life with a special reference to the narratives in which beliefs and habits are related and accounted for. So, you couldn't make it more obvious here. He pretty much says that typically, and most people during his time would not have considered primitive people to have folklore because they were not considered folk. They were not considered to be people. They were generally considered to be savage, barbarous, and generally inferior. But there is a change that has to be made, that has to be reckoned with once you realize that you have these rich tapestry of stories and these lineages of stories that can extend to other places in the world and that are shared by people, obviously. If they have a possibility to share stories, if they have the possibility to retain stories over years and years in their history, it is not a mental deficiency to be able to have these stories. It is just further proof that they are people just like all of us. So this definition there that is designed to be exclusive or meant to be exclusive during its time is really starting to crumble apart. Now, there are a lot of people that are also trying to change that aspect, mostly because you have this realization that not only indigenous people are smart, but also that the common folk, the non-educated Europeans of the day, have a lot in common with the non-educated people of other places. And in this context, really, the demarcation line is really education, much more than money, much more than prowess or intellectual process. People who do not have education to religion and mythology the way that these writers do should also realize that well, there is a rich tradition that happens within them, and some of that is retained in this folklore. So, the student of folklore is thus led to examine the usages, myths, and ideas of the savages which are still retained in rude enough shape by the European peasantry. Lastly, he observes that a few similar customs and ideas survive in the most conservative elements of the life of educated peoples in ritual, ceremonial, and religious traditions and myths. Though such remains are rare in England, we may note the custom of leading the dead soldier's horse behind his master to the grave, a relic of days when the horse would have been sacrificed. This is from Andrew Lang, a Scottish poet, novelist, just a literary critic, and again, person who was distantly connected to anthropology during that time. He does a thing that is called psychical research, kind of the ancestor of psychology, psychiatry as we think of it, and he wrote a bunch of books about folklore, mythology, magic, totemism, and all the things that we have been talking about in the past couple of days slash weeks. So the idea that that ordinary people in Europe are also superstitious, that have these apparently meaningless customs, or for example, burying a soldier with their horse, kind of goes to show that there is not that much of a chasm between the indigenous folks and the white folks. That all of this is really just an arbitrary distinction that has been made over the years that is not very meaningful. And therein lies the problem, as Lane tells us, because the possibility of having people that are different from quote unquote us, but those people are also very similar to quote unquote us, means that a lot of the things that we had assumed were different this whole time was probably not so different after all. It's just a matter of perspective in the end. And Land says we now approach the third and really important problem. Is there any reason to suppose that the stronger peoples, like the Aryans and the Semites, ever passed through a stage of culture in which female, not male kinship was chiefly recognized, probably as a result of polyandry? Now, the nature of the evidence, which affords a presumption that Aryans have all passed through Australian institutions such as polyandry, is of extremely varied character. Most of it may undoubtedly be explained away, but such strength as the evidence has, which we do not wish to exaggerate, is derived from its convergence to one point, namely the anterior existence of polyandry in the matriarchal family among Aryans before and after the dawn of real history. Yes, if you look back far enough, it turns out that people used to have a lot in common at some point or another, and certainly with the assumption that we all come from the same place. And, kind of a sidebar here, at the time, this was a very new thinking that all of humanity could be coming from the same place. And many people who believe that all of humanity came from the same place believe it was in Asia, not in Africa, for once again, racist reason. So finding a way to reconcile these ideas, and especially if you assume that quote unquote Aryans or quote unquote Semites are superior race, and those things could crumble away very quickly by just looking at the path in which different people have taken over the years. And sure, you could also, and that will be the case immediately after this era, explain this in terms of evolution. So in 1884, people are just barely discovering evolution as written by Darwin. It takes a little bit of while to exist, but evolution becomes used by racists to explain that, yes, of course, we have a lot in common, but we have evolved to be superior. Of course, we could share a distant relationship. Of course, this is entirely possible, but we have evolved to be better, and we have taken this very specific path that makes us superior. Now, at the time, because that vocabulary didn't quite exist, it was much more of a questioning that was happening of, well, perhaps if we have all these things in common, perhaps we are a lot more similar than we think we are. So Land is really trying to figure out these ancient European customs, because these are the kinds of things that could reconnect us with our past, reconnect us with our history, and really make sense of where we are. And this is something that he looks back to pretty far into, of course, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And he says here there remains the evidence of actual fact and custom among Aryan peoples. The Lycian, according to Herodotus, have this peculiar custom wherein they resemble no other men. They derive their names from their mothers, not from their fathers, and through mothers reckon their kin. Status also was derived through the mothers. So, as part of their existence, a group of people that would have been considered Aryan at the time, and again, right after all of this era, the word Aryan comes to lose any kind of meaning, but that's another story. There is this custom that exists during this time of people who believe themselves to be unique, number one, and unique because they are inheriting their entire culture and their entire existence through their mother's line, through their mother's name. So having this group of people that should have been considered to be Aryan, white, superior, whatever, but at the same time was economically powerful, was politically powerful, and yet practiced a form of politics and kinship that was considered to be uh, um, savage or barbarous and whatnot, goes to show that maybe these things should be disconnected. That, of course, people believe all kinds of things, but that's not to say that it is a differentiation to the value of their culture, to the value of their people. So, reconciling these different parts of our science, reconciling these different definitions, and on top of that, trying to make sense of those weird disciplines that professional disciplines have come into play, is also kind of an obstacle for us to make sense of how these myths and legends are really working out.